Epoch.
Epoch stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, which is ludicrous, which is why we call it epoch, right? And what we're talking about when we're discussing the idea of epoch is the fact that when I stop exercising, I continue breathing hard. Right? So if you go for a run and you stop running, you don't stop puffing. Right? Is that right? Anybody stop puffing as soon as they stop moving? You do? No, I'm kidding. Alright, so why are we still puffing? Because we mentioned briefly in lab yesterday that the reason we breathe is to get oxygen in, to pick up the hydrogen. Right? And so if I'm not moving and I'm not making ATP, why would I still need to be breathing heavily for a while? So epoch is our current understanding of how that works. So what we're looking at here is oxygen consumption, so oxygen that cells are using, all right? And along the x-axis is time. The bottom dotted line here is how much oxygen you're using when you're resting. So you're sitting still or you're lying down, okay? How much oxygen do I need at that point? So it's pretty low because even though you're making ATP, you're not making a lot of ATP because you're not working very hard when you're at rest. Make sense? So our resting level of oxygen consumption is quite low. When I start to move, as soon as I start to move, I need ATP. And the most effective way of getting ATP is aerobic exercise, aerobic metabolism, right? But we talked already about the fact that we can't go from rest immediately into aerobic exercise, that it takes a little bit of time to get to Krebs cycle. So we have a period of time where we could do with more oxygen and make more ATP, but we have to go without it until we're ready. So when we plot that, how much oxygen we're consuming, we see a curve like this until we get to a point where the amount of oxygen required for the level of work is coming in. That's called steady state when you see that plateau on the graph. That means that if I go down and I get on the treadmill and I'm bumping up the speed on the treadmill, then until I get to the point where I stop bumping up the speed, I'm on this curve. Okay. So once I get to my 6 mile an hour, 7 mile an hour, whatever I'm going to do, and I'm chugging along at exactly the same workload, then my breathing gets a bit easier at that point. Because now I'm balancing how much oxygen I'm consuming and how much energy I'm putting out to run at 6 or 7 miles an hour. If I bump up the speed again, this will go up again until I stay at the same workload. So steady state is a point in time when my workload is consistent and therefore the systems in my body can just tick over at the level required to provide energy for that workload. There's some frowning going on. All right, we'll go back in a minute. So, between here and here, I could have done with more oxygen, but I don't have it available. So we rely on system 1 and system 2 to get us ATP until we can get to system 3. The first shaded area here then is called the oxygen deficit. It's a measurement of the amount of oxygen we needed versus the amount of oxygen we were actually consuming at that time. So it's an imbalance during systems 1 and 2. We plod along at our 6 miles an hour, and then we stop the treadmill. So here's the end of my exercise. I stop the treadmill. If I've stopped the treadmill and I'm not running at 6 miles an hour anymore, I don't need that amount of oxygen anymore. So my breathing starts to drop down. But it doesn't drop off back to here. It takes a while for our breathing to slow down. When I was in undergrad, eons ago, right, this shaded area was exactly the same size as this shaded area because we thought they balanced each other out. That doesn't appear to be the case anymore as we've learned more about it. What we see is that the breathing at the end of the exercise actually allows us to take in more oxygen than we actually created a deficit for. So why? Why is the oxygen debt, is the old term, when I was your age, it was called the oxygen deficit and the oxygen debt. Most literature now is going to call it EPOC. So if you're looking at something that calls it oxygen debt, chances are it's a little bit out of date. So why is EPOC bigger than the original deficit that I built up? Right? What we think is that this fast portion here, where the curve is very steep, right, that's about 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how fit you are, because the fitter you are, the shorter this part of the curve is. This 2 minutes or so here is the oxygen I need to rebuild phosphocreatine. So yesterday in lab, we busted up our phosphocreatine and released the energy, right? And we had creatine floating around on its own and an inorganic phosphate floating around on its own. Yes? If I'm going to put my creatine and my inorganic phosphate back together so I can steal the energy bond again the next time I run, I have to have an energy bond. The energy bond doesn't come out of thin air. I have to have ATP to break up to get the energy bond to stick. It's all a little bit convoluted, right? But I've got to get the energy bond from an ATP. But I have any ATP left in the cell because I used it all earlier on. So I have to keep breathing and making ATP aerobically so that I can break the ATP to rebuild the phosphocreatine so that the next time I want to run, I've got phosphocreatine there. So that's what they think currently. It may change over the next 5 to 10 years, so you've got to keep an eye on the literature. But that first 2 minutes, fast, it's called the rapid or the fast phase, is rebuilding phosphocreatine. The slower part of the curve is making energy available to move lactate out of the cell. to help you cool your body down, because your body temperature goes up when you exercise, and so you have to move blood to the surface to lose body temperature. It takes energy to move things around. We stole some oxygen that was in the bloodstream and in the muscle cell right at the beginning. We have to put that back. That's kind of our backup storage. Right? So we have to put that back. So that's what's going on here. Now, it's easy to see this if I have an aerobic piece of work. Okay. What happens if you're late for class in the computer lab when you finish in here? And no, we're not going to go out and get in that car and drive across the road. So, take the car out of the picture. You have class in the computer lab, and I talk too much and I make you late.
You have to run.
You have to run. When you run up the stairs to go over the bridge, what happens? You guys don't suffer this too much because you're in shape, but what happens when you run up the stairs?
Fatigue. So tired. Start breathing.
You breathe hard.
You breathe harder, right? When you get to the top of the stairs. Is running up the stairs aerobic or anaerobic?
Anaerobic.
Anaerobic. So why am I breathing harder then? Because I didn't need any oxygen in the first place. Right? So Epoch explains heavy breathing after an anaerobic piece of exercise. Because if I'm doing anaerobic work, what do I end up with at the end? What do I have in my cell at the end of anaerobic? Hydrogen, maybe lactic acid or lactate. I've got to get rid of those because they cause fatigue. So even though running up the stairs is anaerobic and didn't take any oxygen, I need oxygen to come in to get rid of the byproducts of running up the stairs. So even though I don't breathe in order to run up the stairs, at the top of the stairs I go because I need oxygen in to get rid of the hydrogen and the lactic acid and lactate. And that is all we need to know about Epoch. Right? Got it? Easy peasy. Easy. Okay, so go away. All right, so I am going to assume, so tell me if I'm wrong, that you found the material in chapter 11 at the beginning of the semester a bit easier than the material in chapter 2. Right? So in a minute, if you have questions about material in chapter 11, you get a chance to ask them. But right now I'm going to make the assumption that chapter 11 is pretty easy. Okay? So, let's go to chapter 2. What do I know about making energy? Okay? So, first off, what do I use to make it? What do I use? What? Thank you. What molecule does a human use? So what is it we're trying to make? We're trying to make ATP. Right? So I have 3 systems that I can use for ATP. What's the first system? No.
Oh.
What's the first system?
ATP plus
ATP PC system. How long is the ATP PC system predominant in making energy for us? 5 to 15, 20, somewhere around there, seconds. Okay. Who's going to use this system? What kind of athlete? Football player? Sprinters? Weightlifters? Okay. What is system 2? Glycolysis, good. What am I feeding into glycolysis? Carbs?
Fats, protein.
Nope, just carbs. Which kind of carbs? Fish and chips? No. Which kind of carbs am I feeding in? What can I chuck in at the top? What are my 2 options for carbohydrate? Glycogen and glucose, right. So I've got either glycogen or glucose. What do I end up with at the end? Pyruvate. Good. See, look at all this stuff you know. Okay. How many ATPs do I get?
6. 1.
2.
3.
2 on each.
20. So 4. It's 4.
Alright, so I make 4. How many do I use?
2. 6. 1. Use
Okay,
1.
when do I use 1?
To get rid of the ATP.
Get.
One you pop.
Okay, so I'm going to use an ATP. When else do I use an ATP?
When you.
When you have to replace it with
Alright,
With glucose.
ish, good. Alright, so I'm gonna, if I use glucose, I'm gonna use another one. Right? So I get -1, -2, +2, +2. If I use glucose, I get 2 ATPs. -1 +2 +2.
Stress.
If I use glycogen, I get 3 ATPs.
Stress.
Right? Easy? Easy peasy. Right? So, if I'm working anaerobically, what does my pyruvate turn into?
Lactic acid.
Lactic acid, we're just going to say lactate because it'll change straight into lactate. Right? If I'm working aerobically, where does my pyruvate go? Where does it get shuttled to?
No.
Mitochondria.
It's going to get shuttled to the mitochondria. And in the mitochondria, we're going to have system 3.
NAD.
What's the first part of system 3? Okay, Krebs cycle. When I get my pyruvate to the mitochondria, what do I have to turn it into to put it into Krebs cycle?
Oxygen. No, ACE.
Oxidase, right?
Oxidase.
Acetyl-CoA.
Oh, acetyl. I said ACE and ACE to
Right?
It's cold.
So, my carbohydrate gets broken down in glycolysis. I am either going to turn it into lactate, or I'm going to shuttle it to the mitochondria and I'm going to start aerobic metabolism via Krebs cycle. If I'm breaking down triglycerides, then I'm going to use fat breakdown, not carbohydrate breakdown. Right? So, instead of glycolysis, I would use beta oxidation, but beta oxidation is not an energy system because we don't make any ATP. But beta oxidation is how we break down a triglyceride, stored fat. I break it down to acetyl-CoA. I can feed it into Krebs cycle and make ATP. Right? So I can use carbohydrate the normal way that we use carbohydrate, or I can break down a fat molecule and I can also use a fat molecule. I can also break down a protein molecule and get acetyl-CoA and use protein to feed Krebs cycle, but we don't do it very often. So it's not very beneficial to think of protein as an energy source. So, do I have a lot of ATP yet? No, not very much. Okay? So, that's not very helpful really, because we need a lot of ATP. Okay? So, somehow, I've got to get a ton of ATP. So, during my Krebs cycle, I give off lots of hydrogen. I am going to shuttle my hydrogen where? ETC or ETS, depending on where you're looking. What's the bus?
NAD
or FAD? Electron transport chain, tons of ATP, loads and loads of ATP, more ATP if I'm breaking down a fat, less ATP if I'm breaking down a carb, but still the predominant amount of ATP comes from the electron transport chain. What happens when I get to the bottom of the electron transport chain? You have to have oxygen. Okay? And we're going to make water, and it's easy to get rid of. Right? Who's going to use this system?
Aerobic.
Cyclists.
Oxygen.
Runners.
Walkers.
Okay? Walkers.
Joggers. Swimmers.
Identifying this system, how long does this system go for? What, how long? From about
30 seconds to 2 minutes.
30 seconds to 2 minutes. So by 3 minutes, if you're still moving at 3 minutes, then you're switching to aerobic metabolism. But you're only using carbohydrate at that point, because how long does it take to switch to fats?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Right? So between 3 minutes and 19 or 20 minutes, you're going to be using predominantly carbohydrate. If you're still moving at 20 minutes, you're still working aerobically, but now you've had time to start breaking down some fat molecules. Yeah? Easy.
Easy.
Easy. Right?
Yeah.
Are we going to have
On the test, there will be blank paper, and I am not of the opinion that tests have to be handed in neat and tidy. I am of the opinion that tests have to be handed in accurate. So as long as I can read what answer you want me to take, you can scribble whatever diagrams or notes you want. I know what I will be drawing if I was you when I walked into the room. Alright, so, next question. Lactate threshold. Which way, if I train hard, which way does my lactate threshold move?
Up. To the right.
To the right. What does that result in? If I move my lactate threshold to the right, what does it allow me to do? What's the point of it shifting? Because it's an adaptation. If it's an adaptation, then it must be positive. So what's the point?
You're more physical.
No, that's not completely incorrect, and it is to do with VO2 max, because your VO2 max would be the percentage measure of intensity or heart rate.
Oxygen is not, oxygen burden is very sufficient. More mitochondria.
More mitochondria is an aerobic adaptation. If I shift the lactate threshold to the right, I'm increasing the intensity level that I can work at until I start to utilize carbohydrate and glycolysis again. Because then I start building up lactate and then I start fatiguing quickly. So if I shift this to the right because I train properly, then it allows me to work harder before I start to fatigue. Okay, so we have 10 minutes. Jump in with partners or study on your own, however you prefer. At the back of your chapters are review questions. What I have done is go through the review questions and pick the ones that I think are the most crucial. Doesn't mean that not all of them are useful. It's just that if you look at one of these questions and you're like, I don't know what that means, we're in trouble. Okay? So, on chapter 2, fill in the blank, number 2 and number 4. Multiple choice. Number 1, 2, 3, and 5.
What was the ones again?
2 and 4. True, false. 1, 2, 3, 4. Chapter 11. Fill in the blank. 1, 4, and 5. Multiple choice. 1, 3, 4, and 5. True, false. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright? So, at the minimum, when you look at those questions, you should not be going, I have no idea what that question is talking about. Right? You should at least have an idea what the question is talking about, and you should be able to find that information in the chapter or in your notes. Okay?
Can you call out multiple choice for chapter 2?
Sure. 1, 2, 3, 5. Yes, sir.
Are you gonna post these answers?
Yes. After class, I will post the answers for the question. Alright? So that should help you study for Monday. So you've got 5 or 6 minutes now. Get going. Anybody got any other questions on anything else that we've covered since the beginning of the semester? Body composition, fat mass, carbs, proteins. All right, so make a start. After class, at the end of class, we're going to have another go at the question. And then Monday we will have the exam. Those of you who have not had class with me before, my exams are multiple choice, short answer, hard. Thanks. They're not hard. They're multiple choice, which means the answer's sitting right there. Multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank. Usually there's some bonuses.
What was the answer to the first 2 points? What was the answer?
It's gonna be the same question. Right? It's gonna be the same question.
No, the 2-point thing you asked us today.
We're about to do it again. I'm not going to give you the answer yet. I gave you the answer if you were listening. So,
That's when you were texting.
alright, so it's you. I can't remember how many questions. They're usually around 30 questions. There's plenty of blank space to scribble on. Alright, it is not open book, but you are allowed to come and ask me questions. Don't ask me what the answer is, because that's not a question I'm going to answer. And as I said, my way of dealing with it, if I was you, I would walk in and I would write down everything I'm not sure about. Right? Because if I've got to keep remembering it, that's stressful, and then I'm not paying attention to everything else I'm reading. So if there's something, a diagram, or some bullet points, or however you study, you can walk in, scribble it down. Now you don't have to remember it. You can concentrate on the rest of the exam. That's how I do it. Everybody does things differently. All right? You're allowed to ask me questions. So study wisely. Most of the exam is multiple choice. But it is not generally exactly the same way it's written in the textbook, because I want you to think about the material, not regurgitate the material. But that means you can come, yes ma'am.
Do you still have bonus questions?
There are some bonus questions, yes. That means that you can come over and you can say, you know, I know this is system 2, and I know that means this and this and this, but I'm not thinking what this is. If I hear all the right links, then I can help you, I can guide you with some tips, right? But I'm not going to answer the question for you. If you come over and you go blah-de, 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 blah, nothing you say is at all relevant, I ain't helping out, okay? So you've got to put the work in if you want to be able to use me as a resource. Right? Okay.